The tragedy of Prince Rainier's life when he married Grace Kelly. The fairy tale they sold you. 30 million people cried watching her wedding, and not one of them knew that the woman walking down that aisle had slept with at least 5 married co-stars, had pregnancy in secret to protect her career, and had passed a royal medical examination that had been quietly arranged to ask only the right questions and none of the wrong ones. Grace Kelly. If you don't know who she is, here's everything you need. She was Hollywood's biggest star in the 1950s, won an Oscar at 25, then walked away from it all to marry Prince Rainier III and become the Princess of Monaco. The world called it the most beautiful fairy tale of the 20th century. This video is going to tell you what was actually happening behind it. Before this video is over, you'll understand why Grace Kelly needed this marriage far more than Rainier did. You'll understand why MGM, one of the most powerful film studios in Hollywood, had cameras rolling inside that cathedral on her wedding day, and exactly what they received in return. And at the end, I'm going to tell you something about the afternoon of September 13th, 1982, the day Grace Kelly's car cliffed on the same road where she had once filmed one of her most iconic scenes. She died the next day. Her daughter Stephanie, who was in the passenger seat, walked away with minor injuries. The official report said, accident. No further investigation was requested. No files were ever made fully public. But here is the question that nobody asked loudly enough. Who exactly benefits when the one person who knows every secret about a royal family, the affairs, the arranged medical examinations, the financial negotiations, the years of private correspondence, dies suddenly before she can write a memoir, before she can give an interview without restraint, before she can finally stop performing? Was it an accident? Possibly. Probably even. But the silence that followed it, fast, total, and permanent, was not accidental at all. That kind of silence requires effort, and effort, as Grace Kelly understood better than anyone, is always in service of something. You don't need to know anything about Hollywood to understand this story, because this is not really a story about Hollywood. It's about something every single one of us understands. What it costs when you spend your whole life building a perfect image, and then one day realize you can no longer find the way back out of it. The girl who was never enough. Grace Patricia Kelly was born in Philadelphia in November 1929, into a family where success was not a goal. It was the minimum standard for being taken seriously. Her father, Jack Kelly, was a self-made millionaire, a 3-time Olympic gold medalist in rowing, and one of the most respected men in Philadelphia. Her mother had been a collegiate athletics coach. Her older brother Kel would go on to win Olympic gold himself. Her sister Peggy was socially polished and popular. And then there was Grace, the third child, frequently ill, quiet, introverted, and constitutionally unsuited to the athletic world her family worshipped. She was not the golden child her parents had envisioned. She was different. And in the Kelly household, different was not a compliment. So Grace did what children do when they cannot win the game being played in front of them. She invented her own. She retreated into an inner world of storytelling and imagination, began performing in local theater at 10 years old, and by the time she left for the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York at 18, she had made a decision that would shape every relationship she ever had. She was going to make her father proud. Or she was going to build something so large that his approval no longer mattered. She would spend the rest of her life trying to do both at once and failing at both. Here is what that psychology produced. Throughout her years in Hollywood, Grace Kelly was not drawn to young men, available men, or men who needed her. She was drawn consistently, repeatedly, almost without exception, to older men who already had wives. Gary Cooper, Clark Gable, Ray Milland, Bing Crosby, every single one of them was at least 20 years her senior. Every single one of them had a wife at home, and every single one of them, in some way, resembled the man whose approval she had been chasing since she was a child. This is not gossip. This is the architecture of a woman's psychology laid bare. What Hollywood knew and never printed. The studio system of 1950s Hollywood operated on one foundational rule. The image is the product, and the product must be protected at all costs. MGM's contracts contained a clause called the Morality Clause, a legally binding agreement that gave the studio the right to terminate any actor's contract immediately if their personal behavior threatened the studio's reputation. Affairs, scandals, public embarrassments, all grounds for dismissal. No appeal, no compensation. Grace Kelly violated this clause by any honest reading of it at least 3 separate times, and MGM never once exercised it against her. the question that no one asked loudly enough at the time: why? The answer is simpler and colder than you might expect. Grace Kelly made money. She was nominated for an Academy Award for her second film. She won one for her fourth. Alfred Hitchcock, the most commercially reliable director in Hollywood, had specifically requested her for 3 consecutive films. When an asset generates that kind of return, studios do not terminate contracts. They manage information. So the affairs were managed. The headlines were softened. The stories were buried or redirected. When her romance with Ray Milland during the filming of Dial M for Murder became impossible to contain, Milland's wife had hired a private investigator. The tabloids had photographs. The story was running whether MGM liked it or not. The studio let Grace absorb the damage. She was labeled a homewrecker in the press. Fan mail turned hostile. Her reputation, which had been built on the precise quality of cool, untouchable elegance, was beginning to crack. During the filming of Mogambo in Africa, her romance with Clark Gable became the subject of enough whisper that Grace's mother flew to the location to chaperone. It made no difference. When a journalist later asked Grace directly about it, she gave them a line that became one of the most quoted in Hollywood history. "What else is there to do if you're alone in a tent in Africa with Clark Gable?" She wasn't denying it, she was reframing it. And that, the ability to reframe any situation into something that worked in her favor, was perhaps Grace Kelly's most underestimated talent. By early 1955, she had also been involved with Bing Crosby, had nearly married fashion designer Oleg Cassini before her family forced an end to that relationship, and had quietly a pregnancy that she never publicly acknowledged. A woman who had everything the world can see: beauty, talent, an Oscar on her mantelpiece, and a private life that was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. She was 25 years old and already exhausted from the performance. She needed a way out. The fourth name on the list. Here is something that was not in the fairy tale version of this story. Grace Kelly was not Rainier's first choice. In the mid-1950s, Prince Rainier III of Monaco was facing a crisis that had nothing to do with romance. Monaco was a 2.2 square kilometer principality drowning in debt, with a casino that was losing its clientele, and a political treaty with France from 1918 that contained a devastating clause. If the reigning prince died without a legitimate heir, Monaco would automatically be absorbed into France. Rainier needed a wife. More specifically, he needed a wife who could produce an heir and simultaneously function as a marketing strategy for a country that was struggling to remain relevant. A mutual acquaintance, some accounts name Aristotle Onassis, who had significant financial interests in Monaco, circulated a short list of suitable American actresses. Marilyn Monroe was reportedly on it. She declined, reportedly referring to Rainier as Prince Rainier and telling friends she had no interest in giving up her career for a man she'd never met. Other names were considered and dismissed for various reasons. Grace Kelly was the fourth name. She was approached in the spring of 1955 during the Cannes Film Festival. A meeting was arranged at the Palace, formally organized by Paris Match magazine, as a photo opportunity. A piece of content about a Hollywood actress visiting a European royal. Both parties understood it was more than that. Grace arrived 45 minutes late. Her hair had been hastily done. She wore a floral dress that was carefully chosen to appear unconsidered. When Rainier led her through the private zoo on the palace grounds, she walked directly up to the enclosures without hesitation, and reached toward the animals with a calm steadiness that Rainier would later describe to friends as the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen in a woman. What Rainier saw as innate courage was something her colleagues in Hollywood would have recognized immediately. It was stagecraft. The ability to read a room, identify what it needs, and deliver precisely that within 30 seconds of entering. Grace Kelly had been doing this since she was 10 years old, performing in school plays to earn the attention of a father who was watching his son row toward Olympic gold. Rainier left that meeting convinced he had found something rare. He had found an extraordinary woman. What he had actually found was an extraordinary performance, and the performer behind it had a very specific reason to give the performance of her life that afternoon. $2 million and a medical exam. Rainier traveled to Philadelphia in December 1955 and proposed within 3 days of arriving. Behind the official narrative of love at first sight was a financial negotiation that Jack Kelly, Grace's father, found insulting enough that he nearly ended the whole arrangement. In accordance with European royal tradition, Rainier required a dowry, Estimates put the figure at $2 million. Jack Kelly, a man who had built his own fortune without inheriting a cent, told Rainier directly, "My daughter does not pay anyone to marry her." The negotiation was resolved. Some accounts suggest Grace contributed a portion from her own savings. The full financial details have never been made public, but the dowry was not the most significant condition Rainier placed on the marriage. Before any engagement could be formalized, Grace was required to undergo a complete medical examination by physicians approved by the Monegasque royal household. The purpose was explicit: to confirm that she was physically capable of bearing children. Monaco's survival as an independent nation depended on an heir. This was not a romantic consideration, it was a constitutional one. Grace passed the examination without issue. Every document was clean. What the examination did not ask about, what no one representing Rainier thought to request, or perhaps thought it prudent to request, was a full gynecological history. The prior relationships, pregnancy, the decade of a private life that bore no resemblance to the public image of cool Catholic elegance that MGM had spent years constructing around her. The Kelly family had the connections, the money, and the motivation to ensure that the physicians conducting this examination received a file that contained precisely what it needed to contain, and nothing else. Rainier's doctors signed the confirmation. He had no idea what he was signing with it. The wedding, MGM produced, April 19, 1956. The Cathedral of St. Nicholas, Monaco. 600 guests, 30 million television viewers. A wedding dress constructed from 270 meters of antique Valenciennes lace, worked by 50 seamstresses over 6 weeks. And MGM Studios cameras positioned throughout the cathedral, filming every moment. This is the detail that changes everything you think you know about that day. MGM did not film that wedding out of generosity or historical interest or sentiment. They filmed it because Grace Kelly had negotiated it deliberately and precisely as the price of her freedom. The studio held a contract that still had several films remaining. Grace wanted out. The deal that was struck, MGM would release her from her remaining obligations in exchange for the exclusive rights to film the wedding and distribute the footage commercially. In other words, Grace Kelly paid for her escape from Hollywood by turning her own wedding into a film production. She did not leave Hollywood on the arm of a prince. She left Hollywood by converting the most personal moment of her life into a product one final time, and handing it to the studio as settlement. Rainier stood at the altar that morning, believing he was marrying a woman. He was, in a very specific sense, also the lead actor in MGM's final Grace Kelly production. And he was the only person in the cathedral who did not know that. There is a photograph from that ceremony that has been reprinted in thousands of publications. In it, Rainier is looking at Grace with an expression that is genuinely rare on a man of his position. Open, soft, the look of someone who has let their guard down completely. The expression of a man who believes, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, that everything is going to be all right. Grace is looking directly into the camera lens, not because she did not feel anything, but because after 6 years of professional performance, the reflex was, by that point, completely beyond her control. When there was a camera, her face turned toward it. Hollywood had trained that response into her so deeply that she could not override it, not even on her wedding day. Rainier placed a ring on the finger of a woman he had known for less than 5 months. And the woman receiving that ring had spent those 5 months giving the most important performance of her career. The night, April 20th, 1956, the day after the wedding. The guests had gone. The MGM cameras had packed up. The cathedral was empty. The harbor outside the palace windows was still and lit. Grace Kelly sat alone in the princess's bedroom, in a palace of 235 rooms that she had not yet learned to navigate. There was no script to memorize for tomorrow, no call sheet, no director who would knock on the door at 7 o'clock in the morning and tell her what was needed from her that day. For the first time in her adult professional life, there was no role to step into. She had traded one contract for another, except this one had no end date. No exit clause, and an audience of 30 million people who would not forgive her if she stopped performing. She poured a glass of scotch, she looked out at the harbor. And nobody knows what she thought that night because Grace Kelly never told anyone. That silence is the most honest thing about her. 235 rooms and no exit. The first years in the palace established a pattern that would define the rest of the marriage. Rainier issued a ban on the public screening of all of Grace's films within Monaco. The official justification was the protection of the princess's dignity. He did not want the citizens of Monaco watching his wife kiss other men on a large screen. There was something genuine in that motivation. There was also something that people close to Rainier described privately as an obsession. He could not tolerate the existence of the filmed record of her previous life. The result was a profound irony. The woman who had been one of the most visible faces in America was now invisible within the country she lived in. The films that had made her who she was could not be seen within walking distance of her bedroom window. She adapted. That was after all what she had always done. She began drinking privately, carefully, never in a way that would be visible in public. Scotch in the afternoons in her personal rooms. The people who worked closely with her in the palace knew. Rainier knew. Nobody discussed it. She established what the palace staff came to think of as her own court, a network of friends, most of them connected to the arts world she had left behind, who visited regularly and with whom she corresponded extensively. She founded the International Festival of Amateur Theatre, which ran annually from 1972 onward, and brought something back to her that the palace's official calendar of state functions could not provide. But there was something she had left in Hollywood that could not be replaced by festivals or correspondence or Scotch in the afternoon. And in 1962, she found out exactly how much she had lost. The latch that never opened. In 1962, Alfred Hitchcock wrote to Grace Kelly. He was preparing to film Marnie, a psychological thriller about a compulsive thief and the man determined to understand her. He wanted Grace for the lead role. He had directed her in Rear Window, To Catch a Thief, and Dial M for Murder, 3 of the films that had defined her career. He understood something specific about how to use her on screen that no other director had ever quite replicated. Rainier agreed. By some accounts, he genuinely wanted her to have this. He saw what 6 years in the palace had cost her, and he thought perhaps this was something he could give back. The Monegasque press responded within days of the announcement. Letters arrived at the palace. The coverage used language about the princess appearing in romantic scenes with other men. The social pressure was immediate and total. Grace withdrew from the project. Hitchcock found another actress. The film was made without her. Rainier said, in a rare moment of candor, years later, I never forgave myself for that. Grace said nothing about it publicly. Not then, not ever. That silence was different from her usual silence. Most of her silences were performances, controlled, strategic, designed to communicate without speaking. This one felt like something else, like a door closing that neither of them acknowledged had been a door at all. Tippi Hedren played the lead in Marnie. It was the last role Grace Kelly could have had. She never stood in front of a professional camera again. The road she drove in a film. This is what I promised you at the beginning. The D37 road along the cliffs above La Turbie, Monaco. This is the road that Hitchcock chose in 1955 for one of the most famous sequences in To Catch a Thief. Grace Kelly behind the wheel of a convertible, Cary Grant in the passenger seat, the Mediterranean hundreds of feet below, and Grace laughing, completely at ease, in total control of a vehicle, on a road that would kill you if you lost your concentration for 3 seconds. The sequence required multiple takes. Grace performed every one of them without hesitation. 27 years later, on the afternoon of September 13, 1982, a Rover 3500 left the D37 road and fell 35 meters down the same cliff face. Grace was in the car. Her youngest daughter Stephanie, 17 years old, was with her. The car had no brake marks on the road before the point of departure. Grace died the following day from cerebral. Here is what the official investigation confirmed. Mechanical failure was ruled out. The car was in normal operating condition. Grace died. Stephanie survived with minor injuries. Here is what the official investigation did not answer. A French forensic physician confirmed that Grace had experienced a small ischemic stroke, a sudden interruption of blood supply to part of the brain, prior to the crash. This is the most medically supported explanation for why the car left the road without any visible attempt to brake or correct. But Stephanie, in a television interview that she later partially retracted, acknowledged that she had been driving at some point during that journey. She described an argument with her mother about her personal life, specifically about a relationship Grace strongly opposed. The details of what exactly Stephanie said and then unsaid have never been fully clarified. And Rainier never requested an expanded investigation. The Monegasque file on the incident has never been made fully public. French police, who technically had jurisdiction over the recovery site, were delayed in accessing the scene in the initial hours. None of this proves anything beyond what the official record states. A woman suffered a stroke, and a car arose. That is what the documents say. But here is what sits alongside those documents. Grace Kelly, who had spent her entire adult life maintaining absolute control over everything that was visible about her, her image, her relationships, her exits, and her entrances, died on the same road where she had once performed perfect control for a camera. And the exact circumstances of what happened in that car in the minutes before it left the road have never been fully publicly explained. The silence around it is familiar. It is the same kind of silence that followed Grace Kelly through her entire life. Protective, deliberate, and expensive. The only question that mattered. Rainier III of Monaco died on April 6, 2005. He had ruled for 56 years, longer than any other monarch in modern European history. Under his reign, Monaco transformed from an indebted principality into one of the wealthiest territories in the world by per capita income. The casino recovered. Tourism boomed. The French annexation never came. By every measurable standard, the transaction that began in a palace courtyard in 1955 had succeeded. He needed a brand. He acquired one. The country survived. He never remarried. There is a detail that emerged after his death from people who worked in the palace in his final years. On his desk in his private study, there was a single photograph. Not a formal portrait, not a diplomatic photograph. A photograph of Grace Kelly on their wedding day. In the cathedral, in the dress, with the light on her face exactly as it appeared in 30 million living rooms. Looking directly at the camera. He kept that photograph for 23 years. And if you think about what it means, that the image he chose to keep was the one where she was looking away from him, then you understand something about that marriage that no biography has ever quite put into words. 30 million people watched that wedding and saw a fairy tale. They needed it to be one. We all needed it. And Grace Kelly, who had understood since she was a child that what people need from you is more powerful than anything you actually are, had given it to us. She could not stop. Not because Monaco wouldn't allow it, not because Rainier wouldn't allow it, but because the audience, all 30 million of us, and every person who came after, would not have accepted anything less than perfect from a woman we had decided was a princess. The cage was not built by a prince. It was built by everyone who ever looked at that photograph and felt something beautiful. Grace Kelly spent her whole life being exactly what other people needed her to be. And the most tragic part of that story is not that she was trapped by it. It's that by the end, she may no longer have known the difference between the performance and the person underneath it. Neither did we. And that is the only part of this story that belongs to all of us.